Bonjour, bonjour.
So, hello to everybody. My name is Jérôme Chapuis. I'm in charge of La Croix magazine. We are partners of the meeting. So, please, can I remind you that it is your duty to wear a mask in this auditorium. You all know why. I'd also like to say hello to everybody who's following us online. I'm very happy to be moderating this panel discussion about a theme that is coming back into the news. Should we adopt a basic universal income? So with me on the stage we have Karine Legendre from the Circle of the Economists. She's a professor at the university here in Aix-Marseille. And then we have 5 speakers. Marjorie Alexandre, you are a member of Force Ouvrière. In fact, you're the secretary of that union. You're in charge of Europe and migration. Then we have Philippe Van Paru. You are a philosopher, a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain, and you are in charge of the Basic Earth Network, presented as the godfather of the basic universal income. Hello, Benoît Hamon, former Minister of National Education. The basic universal income was one of your points on your program for the presidential election in 2015. Then we have Alfonso Pradga, former Minister of Finance for Argentina. And we are also with Erwan Tisson from Sapien Institute. So Alfonso is with us from Argentina. You're the former Minister of Finance for Argentina, and you're online with us from Buenos Aires. So without further ado, let's let you have the floor. Karine Legendre, you have the floor. Yes, hello everybody. So during this session we'll be talking about basic income or a universal income. We use both these notions. I think it's important to begin with to really define what we're talking about when we say universal income. The universal income is the same income distributed to everybody and not to a home without anything in exchange. Now, setting up this kind of income, it's an ideal, a social ideal, not just an economic policy, creating something equal for everybody. And yet this old idea is not getting the buy-in from public opinion. We can see this from the referendum in Switzerland in 2016. They refused the setting up of a universal income or the lack of signatures for taking the debate to the European Commission. Now, the reason often given in surveys is the fear that workers will give themselves too much time off. So if we look at the polls, people are for the idea. They think that they can do a lot with the universal income. You know, when you ask them what they want to do, they say there are many things that they would like to, but their fear is that the others will stop working. But this was before the COVID crisis. Since then, the recovery plans set up everywhere have been very well perceived. And this redistribution of income has been carried out without anything in exchange. So is there a new door being opened to the introduction of a universal income? That's the question. So I've prepared some questions for our speakers. I've focused on 3 points. The first is, what would be the objective of setting up a universal income? And what about the context? Is it in order to solve the social system that is not working or that is absent, which can be the case in developing countries? Is it so that we have a transition revenue to accompany the industrial revolution underway that will lead to professional redirections and training costs? Is it supposed to be a permanent income to get over the problem of stagnating salaries and the fact that bad jobs are being generated? So that's the first point. Second point, what are the expected effects of this measure? Now, very intuitively, an extreme simplification from an administrative point of view, if we distribute the same income to everybody, everybody will benefit from it. So that would be much simpler, wouldn't it? And the second question, what are going to be the effects on the economic behaviors of beneficiaries, especially when it comes to the job market? How will people react? What do we know about the potential reactions? And if we look at things with the little bit of hindsight that we have some experiments that have been carried out, but not really based on the universal income such as defined. So experiments have taken place across the world since 1970, but these are temporary experiments. During a period, income was given to populations, target populations, often populations in need. So what did we observe? An increase in consumption, a drop in poverty, very few effects in terms of the offer of employment for those already working, and a drop in work for women with children, a drop in work for students, a drop in judicial expenditure. So it's very positive effects globally. But as I said, these experiments only lasted a short period of time. And they weren't really based on a universal income. They targeted populations in a situation of poverty. So can we, apply these conclusions to a case where we have a universal income that's distributed permanently to all sections of the population? Furthermore, these initiatives were often based on philanthropy. So I've almost finished. This leads me to my last question, or my last point. I've already given you three. So the next point, and here again, I've got lots of questions for the next point. How should we actually implement this universal income, if it has to be implemented, in a country like France, where there is a very good social protection system? What kind of benefits will the income replace? And in the European context, should we think about coordination between countries? Should we set up new taxes? And if yes, which ones? And what would be the impact of this new tax system on employment? And the last, with this universal income, we would be losing the targeting tools that we have to fight against inequality. So how do you manage that? So you have 1 hour to answer all of these questions. So we've actually got 58 minutes. So Philippe Van Paris. So a very simple question, which is in the news today. Why, when we see all of the questions raised, summarized by Karine, why is this universal income more necessary than ever today? Well, given the pandemic, it's become very popular, more popular than in the past. There was a peak in 2016 when Benoît Hamon was leading his campaign, and then the pandemic across the world has brought it back up again. It's become very popular. Why? For three reasons. First of all, there is what we call emergency universal basic income. That's the idea of a universal income for emergency reasons to prevent many people from dying of hunger during the lockdown period. Now, this measure was very important in countries where there were no systems triggered automatically to protect people who were allowed to some form of protection. So it was the more informal the economy, the more autonomous workers there were, the more precarious some workers' situations were, the more the measure was considered important. But so it was based on public debt. The second form was how to get out of the recession. That was the question asked, how to get out of the pandemic. And a second type of proposal was quantitative easing for the people in order to boost the economy. Instead of reducing interest rates, let's just hand out money to the population. Now, this was, of course, relevant given that already quite a lot of money had been taken out of the coffers So the financing should have been based on monetary creation, on creating money. And then if we had a universal income for everybody, financed structurally, not by public debt or by monetary creation, then our economies and societies would have been much more resilient than it was the case. So it's based on the economic climate. It's based on the fundamental reason that made a lot of people opt for the idea of a universal income. It's this idea of freedom, because the universal income is the freedom of saying yes more easily or no more easily, saying yes to jobs that are perhaps not very well paid or paid in an uncertain manner, but are in fact attractive because of the training that they offer. But a bigger freedom to say no because there's no obligation to be available on the job market. So it's easier to say no to a job that is not gratifying, for example, where you're badly treated. And that freedom is today even more important than ever for 3 reasons that I will give you. The first is that more than ever today, we need a kind of YouTube between training, employment and volunteering, especially inside the family throughout our existence. And so this could be covered by a universal income. You know, further education, further training is more important than ever today, and this is something that could be covered by a universal income. Second reason, any society, like any company, has to have a mission, and that is to find for each of its members an activity that people want to do with pleasure, that people do well because that it gives them pleasure, and at the same time something that's useful for the group. So a universal income facilitates each person's search for that activity. And thirdly, and even more fundamentally, we are often confronted with a world, a society, where there are increasing constraints because of a pandemic, because of the climate change, because of the depletion of raw materials, because of various types of pollution. So there are more and more constraints, more and more stress. So we mustn't give up freedom. We must continue to propose a certain form of utopia so that people have more real freedom than what they have today. And a universal income is not the only component of this utopia that we need to move towards, that we need to experience, that gives us the force to carry on. But it is the essential component of that freeing, emancipating utopia. That's why, in my eyes, more than ever, after this pandemic, but more than ever in this 21st century, we need something like a universal income. I'm now going to hand over to Marjorie Alexandre. So we've talked about this emancipating utopia, this mobilizing utopia. So Force Ouvrière, you have some reservations about this. If we look at the grid that Karine Jean went through, the objectives, the possible effects, the how do we set it up, where are your reservations? Yes, hello everybody. So before starting, I'd just like to say that I haven't been to Aix-en-Provence for 22 years. The last time it was to take an exam. But here again, I feel as though this is an oral examination. So that's kind of my state of mind today. Anyway, why is Force Ouvrière prudent rather than opposed to the idea of a universal income? It's because at the moment we feel that we're in a paradox. In other words, on the one hand, we've got people saying there are increasing needs. Needs have increased because of the pandemic crisis, the crisis linked to the pandemic. We also have we had the economic and financial crisis in 2008 that demonstrated that there was an increasing need following the increase in inequality in the working world. And on the other hand, we're in a context where the policies implemented now for several years focus on dismantling social protection that covers the society. So this social protection system that was the fruit of a lot of union struggles in 1945 after the end of the Second World War in an economically devastated country. And yet we set up safety nets in terms of employment insurance, in terms of social security, in terms of maternity leave. And today, while France is the 7th power in the world in terms of GDP, we're being told, be careful, the public debt is exploding. That's not, we can't continue like this. We need to think of new models. This is what the previous panel discussion said. We need to invent a new paradigm. We need to adapt. We need to adapt to the new challenges, climate transition, digital transition challenges, etc. So I heard the criteria, automation, conditionality, and at first glance, for force ouvrière, we can say that yes, it is very generous, except that we are wondering, how do you implement a basic income given the current context where we're being told that we really have to limit public debt? So if we do a quick calculation, I'm not an economist by training, but in terms of considerable limits, if we set up this basic income for a population of 50 million people at 150 euros on a monthly basis, this would amount to 37.5 billion. So, we can think about new solutions, but if we're saying new expenditure, we're saying, well, we need new income. Where does the income come from to cover this? Do we merge the social benefits that we have today? And Force Ouvrière is very much against that, because these minimum social benefits meet specific needs. Now, obviously, these have to be changed. If we take the example of single-parent families, things need to be changed for them. But having said that, up until now, all of the reforms, or all of the transformations, let's say, because a reform makes us think of social progress, but all of the transformations that have happened lately, let's take the example of unemployment insurance, it's based on the same principle. So you individualize rights, so you make the person responsible for their unemployment period, responsible for their period of illness, for their maternity period. You make them responsible, so you transfer the responsibility that the state had to shoulder as guarantor, as social guarantor. You transfer that responsibility to the individual. So where do you find the income to pay for the universal income? Is it new taxes that we need? Do we increase the VAT? Because, again, that would be felt by the beneficiaries of people receiving a minimum income or a basic income, whatever we want to call it. So there are many questions about how to go about it. So these questions, Benoît Hamon, I imagine that you've already thought about these. In 2017, you made this point, the universal income, one of the main points of your presidential campaign. How do you reply to Marjorie Alexander's objections with respect to France? Well, first of all, yes, hello. Yes. There are questions that are being asked everywhere. There are questions that have been asked among employees in the economic context, in the economic environment. Citizens are asking questions that more and more are for the idea of a universal income, as we heard. But let me just tell you a little story. When I was coming, I looked at the assembly before you. They were talking about growth, a subject that is eminently important for economists. And it was the I don't know, the 56th debate on GDP growth, as if that was the only indicator that we should use to judge the health of a nation, which I don't believe in. I'd just like to underline that already. When it comes to the universal income, there's a generational divide. I'm not saying that all young people would be for a universal income, but they're thinking about it given their experience of work and the challenges that they're going to have to solve. So problems that will be left to them by their parents' generation. And then there's the climate problem. But if we take a photo of the room now, and the photo of the room during the previous debate, I can see that there are many people who are between 18 and 30. This shows that around this question of the universal income, the new generations, given their experience and given the needs that they are expressing, access to training, access to employment, and the desire they're expressing the desire to live just as freely as we lived when we were young. Let me come back to some of the criticism about the universal income. I'm going to use 2 points. First of all, I'd like to insist on a point that Philippe brought up. Philippe said that the universal income is the possibility of having freedom, saying yes or no. Now, we are seeing a lot of democratic fatigue in all democracies today. So the question is, how do you regenerate the democracy so that the democracy is still a great mobilizer for citizens? Kant said this himself. You can become tired of being free to the extent that you want to abandon the democracy. So what about democracy in the cities? And then what about the power of a citizen? The power to say yes or no to a good or bad job. So inside the economy, inside a company, being able to say yes or no. What does the universal income change from that point of view? Well, when it's added to an existing salary, obviously, if you do a difficult job or you don't earn much for a difficult job, you could maybe go part-time or leave the job, get training and do something else. So it's a great democratic jump. So we're not limiting ourselves to, do we have to decentralize? Should we change the way we vote? The first thing is that it's a great tool for emancipation, a tool for freedom. And I think that today we need to think about individuals and their freedoms. The second thing, there's another big challenge for coming generations, and that is the climate, the ecological transition that is needed. We forget what the scope of the universal income will be when it comes to consumer behavior changes. Some consumers today have no other choice than to consume low cost. They consume low cost. They produce products, services, manufactured in the most disgusting conditions with the highest carbon footprint. What the universal income changes is that it opens up the possibility for the most poor households to access goods at higher prices, goods that are more respectful in terms of the environment, with a neutral, if not positive, environmental impact. So we facilitate the transformation of consumer behavior. So we allow this part of the population to buy greater quality, to pay more for their products. So these are 2 arguments that I would like to add to the debate. But I think above all, what's happened with the COVID crisis really confirms what we said beforehand. The COVID crisis has just accelerated this process. Because whatever the case, given the failure of all of these redistribution policies, wealth redistribution, so we've got our safety nets, our social safety nets, but we're breaking up all over. For 30 years, we haven't been able to solve the dissymmetry between those who have the capital and those who go out to work. So we need to rethink about wealth redistribution, and one of the instruments to be able to do that is the universal income. So we're now going to join Alfonso Bradgay, who is in Argentina. It's very interesting to hear from you as the former Minister of Finance of a country that's still experiencing great financial difficulties. What is the way you view this question? We've seen the extent to which financing is one of the knotty problems today. So we cannot hear what the minister is saying for the moment. The sound is not working. So we'll try and solve the sound problem. So let me turn, in the meantime, towards Erwan Tizon, because at the beginning we said that the universal income subject goes beyond any form of divide. You are a freelance and you are for this universal income, for you, for yourself. And why is that, if you'd like to? Yes, thank you for that question. As you said, the universal income, it's not because I'm a freelance worker. It's not, against the nature. It's not because I'm a freelancer that I am for the income. There's a tradition from Thomas More through to other economists, and welcome to the big family of liberals, I have to say. There's always this idea of minimum protection, this idea and access to decency. This what Thomas More was saying in Utopia, the universal income was the best way of fighting against criminality, because if you have a full stomach, you don't want to have a fight. So what I'm interested in today is how do we use it in a world that is increasingly uncertain, with exogenous crises that we hear about from specialists. So not simplifying the future. We've seen during the COVID crisis that 60% of French adults were paid directly by the state. This is unheard of in our social history. 60% of French adults. Alongside that, there were hundreds and thousands of people, young people, students, freelancers who had no resources. One young person out of two didn't have enough food. 30% of young people had to go and ask for charity. They were exposed to precarious situations. What does that make me say? We often use the image of a safety net for social protection. I think it's a very real picture. We use a net in order to make sure that people don't fall, but some people go through the holes in the net. So these people didn't receive any help. So there was Le Grand, who explained that most of the time, social aid, for it to be efficient, you have to target the first two targets, not just the first target. So a universal income can help us, but only under certain conditions. The universal income, as the previous speaker said, is a great weapon that affects everybody. I think that in a period of recession, in a crisis period like the one last year, everything collapses, and we don't know where it starts from. We only see the aftermath. We have to be able to trigger this kind of mechanism. If we trigger it in case of a recession, then it has to be switched off when growth starts again. I think, it's polymorphous. We have to have a contra-cyclical weapon that helps us to, as a social dampener when there's a crisis period. So it's triggered when we drop below a certain GDP, so that everybody's covered, absolutely everybody's covered, in spite of the 400 billion that we've invested. There are still holes in the net. And so, we can have a parachute for everybody. And once it's better, we can unplug it. I believe, even if I hear what you're saying when you talk about emancipation, I understand what you're saying. But from a more concrete point of view, we need to have aid that is much more targeted for the job seekers. They need social aid. They need unemployment coverage, but they also need monitoring so that they can get back onto the job market. For people who receive the minimum wage, they need inclusion. They need monitoring. They need people to help them. And I really think about the strength of our social system in a period like this, a recovery period, and this targeting principle that is important. So the universal income, yes, but only when there's a recession, when there's a crisis, and then when we're doing better, then we move back to the ordinary system. So that's going to raise some questions. We can ask Philippe von Paris about this. So first of all, let's just check with the technicians to see whether the sound has been re-established with Argentina, yes or no. No, apparently no. We don't have the sound re-established. I'm sorry, Alfonso Pratgay. Can you hear us, Alfonso? You can hear us? Okay, that's great. Okay, so welcome. So the sound is working. So welcome. Yes, hello everybody. I don't know whether you heard the question. So thank you very much for the invitation to come. So we can hear you very well. Thank you. I'm sorry not to be there with you. I'm sorry to be speaking in Spanish as well, but it will be more efficient for everybody. Okay, thank you very much.
Is a very good excuse to take a look at the issue of a basic universal income. We have seen how the social networks and systems in our countries have been insufficient to withstand such an unprecedented shock. Indeed, it has been necessary.
Gente a quedarse en su casa y no trabajar. Si lo ponemos en términos de John Rawls, el velo de la ignorancia.
Of course, I think there's a lot of ignorance about the universal basic income, and this idea is not well known, and it seeks to achieve equality. What we've learned in the pandemic is that there's a much greater ignorance about this than we believed, not just in terms of talents and opportunities. It would appear that these uncertainties go beyond what we initially thought and affect people as of the time they are born. So, quite frankly, we need much more comprehensive social protection or welfare systems. The logic underpinning a universal income is freedom, equality, and fraternity, as we heard on any number of occasions. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to hold this discussion. I believe, as said earlier on, that we need in various countries to realize that measures brought in are temporary, insufficient. They will not constitute a permanent income. And in some countries, people talk a lot about what will happen to incentives, like in the US. Biden, people are saying, isn't Biden exaggerating his support? Because now there are Americans who prefer to stay at home and to receive support rather than going out to work. So there's a lot of propaganda around this initiative and the problem of incentives or disincentives. Also, I'd like to follow on what some previous speakers said. A number of things have been done in Argentina, thanks to legislators. We have a sort of a law on a kind of basic income for those above the age of 18. This was discussed in Congress, and we will see whether it turns into a law. This basic income will begin at the age of 18, and it will be a comprehensive program which has now been adopted, and I think it's been hugely successful. Of course, there isn't sufficient support, perhaps, in Argentina. A great deal remains to be done. The design and implementation of these programs must be adapted to the socio-economic reality in the country. Freedom is one thing that was referred to. We want to achieve equality as well. However, government is often prepared to spend more, but not to spend better. That's the case of Argentina. Over the last 15 years in Argentina, public spending as a proportion of GDP went from 26% to 42%. That's a 16-point rise. What's paradoxical is that poverty also increased from 26 to 42% as well. Social policies that are being implemented have not managed to do away with poverty. Yet this paves the way for a broader discussion in terms of including more adults in the universal income. Budgetary efforts need to be made in each country. We need to find resources perhaps elsewhere. So it's not all that easy to introduce a basic income, even if it is a crucial measure. And it will be complicated to design. We'll have to ensure that there's no disincentive to taking up work amongst those who receive this income. It should be viewed perhaps as an alternative income, which would not just be a basic income, universal income. It would simply encourage people to work while topping up their income. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, sir. A number of questions have arisen after your statements, and perhaps those who defend the idea of a universal income might like to answer these questions. What about the disincentive to take up work? How would you answer this criticism, which springs to mind when you talk about a universal income? Well, to answer this question, I think you need to clarify 2 points, which were rightly raised by Marjorie. First thing, universal income, it's true, is a fundamentally different model of social welfare. It's different from social support, which was born in the 16th century and which turned into a kind of state support that is fairly systematically organized for poor people. And then there's a second, very different model, which evolved after the end of the 19th century. It's the insurance model. It's not a public system. It's a question of solidarity between workers. At the time, some people hoped that this might completely replace support for the poor, because everyone could become a worker. Initially, only the industrial workers were included in the Bismarck system, and then it evolved. Then you have the model for a universal income, which is a third kind of model. But what's fundamentally different here is that part of the social wealth would be distributed amongst everyone. This third model will not, or should not be, a replacement of the first model, just as the second model didn't fully replace the first. Therefore, the third model isn't designed to replace what exists. It just wants to make things work better. This brings me to a second point. What is the model for universal income? Sometimes it's presented as a dilemma. People say, on the one hand, either you add this to public spending, and you say that's not possible, that's sheer madness. There are lots of current benefits, and they would be replaced by universal income, but that's not acceptable, as you have said quite rightly, because there are a lot of very precarious families which would find themselves in a worse situation than now. So the only kind of model which would be meaningful in my eyes, and that's what Benoit upholds and most reasonable people in Europe, is the following. There would be a sort of an unconditional base, and then there would be a kind of social insurance which would top up this base. The total income of the person who's unemployed, for example, would not drop. It would be an added income. This would provide for additional social support under certain circumstances. In this context, we have to wonder about the impact on work. If there's only a universal income, people might say, well, as Benoit said, well, maybe people won't want to work anymore. But on the contrary, the incentive to work would be greater than with current benefits. However, people wouldn't be forced to accept just any old job. And this kind of subsidy for remunerated work would be given to workers. It would be just a basis, a foundation, which would then be rounded off. And you could thus considerably reduce unemployment. And those who would benefit are the most precarious, and also all those who have a feeling that they could work part-time and interrupt their career to retrain if they had more income. Benoit, there was a question which was put earlier on, and there are many commonalities in what you have all said. The universal income could be temporary. Do you think that a universal income could be switched on or switched off depending on the economic situation? No. If we turn this into a countercyclical tool of economic policy, I think we would need more than 15 minutes to discuss the matter. I don't share the same views. What I think is important to recall, because I'm more interested in raising a certain number of issues. You are going to be asked increasingly to be flexible and able to adapt. Now, what are the tools you will have to adapt when work is changing at an unprecedented speed because of the intensity and frequency of technological innovations, which have a huge impact on the working environment? And the universal income is the counterweight that you give to each individual, who can thus adapt to a new kind of economy, a new kind of labor organization, and which calls for being far more nimble than in the past. And there's some people who say, oh, you have to adapt, we have to be more flexible, but they propose nothing in exchange to citizens, to workers. They need to be able to feel free, to feel autonomy, and to feel that they can be creative in order to develop a real career, have working time and time for personal life. Ask people and politicians this question. The universal income is on the table in order to contend with this change in the economy, which is comparable to the first industrial revolution. Look at the digital revolution. Society used to be dominated by farming, and now it's dominated by industry and plants. These are deep-seated changes, and people haven't thought up a social welfare mechanism, solidarity mechanism to ensure that this digital revolution is progress shared by the largest possible number of people. What I deeply believe is that this is a real transformation, which I think is inevitable. And I note that some people resist this from a political stance. But the Catholic Church has now lifted its reluctance in a relationship to work, which dates back to olden times and a society dominated by Christianism, while the relationship to work has changed considerably. Pope Francis himself published this year a report in favor of universal income rather than a liberal society or a negative taxation, this is an additional support for this. We should stop thinking that a person who doesn't work is just lazy. People who benefit from universal income won't necessarily try to work on the black market. Now, if someone has a universal income today, and that's what I proposed during the presidential elections, if that person, would that person declare that he's going to stop his work? Would you do that? If so, raise your hand. How many people in the room would consider working part-time or going for training? Well, thank you very much. That suits me fine as an answer. What I'm trying to say, and that was said earlier on, the biggest preconceived idea is that just that. I am convinced that if that person will stop working if he gets a universal income, and that person is convinced of the opposite. Of course, maybe you have a poor cousin who drinks too much alcohol during weddings and he's going to stop working. But we've been perfect. We gave a gift to the married people. We have to overcome these preconceived ideas. It's the only argument that is totally baseless, yet it's very difficult to get rid of it. Every time we can prove that this is not the right argument against the universal income, yet this is probably the idea that's most difficult to get out of people's minds who hesitate to support this new form of social protection and welfare. We have a question which we're going to put to Marjorie Alexandre. The purpose of this basic universal income would exist together with other existing benefits. Now, to what degree? How can one interlink the two systems? If I've correctly understood, some of the reservations of Force Ouvrière spring from that. In this matter, I don't know why we think that a universal income can't coexist within the existing system of benefits. Perhaps the existing system could evolve and move towards a model that affords more protection. So why don't we get things to evolve within the existing system, all these collective guarantees which have been established? I wonder about that. And for the time being, I haven't, unless I'm mistaken, been given an answer. How can one finance this universal income? Because currently, under pressure from company leaders, the idea is to get the system to evolve, the system of financing, and workers' contributions should partially be replaced by taxation. So we're not in a system that gives a collective right, but it's this collective right that guarantees the individual rights of workers and their families. So I wonder about this question. And I'd like to react to something that I heard on several occasions in the course of this discussion, namely the possibility or the freedom given to people to accept or turn down a bad job. I agree fundamentally with this idea. No one should have to feel obliged to accept a bad job. But on the one hand, you have the universal income, but you're not solving the problem of the bad job per se. In other words, these bad jobs, why don't they evolve? Why don't we have employment policies to get the conditions of work and salaries evolve? In the pandemic, that really shook the world over the last few months. And we have the second line workers, even if I don't really like that term. So why don't we get these jobs to evolve? We're still going to have such jobs. We need them. So how can they be made to change and evolve? I'll give a brief answer. First question, financing. In a country like France and other European countries, introducing a universal income should go hand in hand with tax reform. There are physical persons who don't pay the first level of tax. That could be replaced by something else. There are low rates which apply to certain levels. As of the first euro you earn, you would pay 30%, say. If we do that and reduce the current social benefits without reducing the total amount received by the beneficiary, well, in this manner, one could finance most of the universal income for the poorer families. There are other needs which will have to be covered. Some of the most precarious workers, part-time workers, will need to, well, there you'll have to perhaps increase taxation on the highest wages. And there are other forms of taxation which could be more equitable. Tax on capital, indirect, as opposed to indirect taxation, which affects everyone concerned. But that's the general model. How are we going to pay for this? Now, as to the actual quality of work, I think there's a very fundamental point. A good job, well, no bureaucrat, no parliamentarian, no professor can determine what a good job is. It's the people themselves who should be able to determine what a good job is or is not. You can't put this on paper. No two cases are the same. It depends on your relationship with colleagues, with your boss, the amount of training required for the job, where the job is, the working hours. The best way to improve the quality of a job is that explained by Fourier. You have to provide certain guarantees, and then bit by bit there will be less and less difference between a job and playing a game. But you should give more power to the people themselves, not to the demagogues or the politicians. It's up to the people themselves to define what a good job is. I'll put this question of financing to Erwan too. Maybe your approach will be different. You're in favor of the universal income. How would you go about financing it? Well, in terms of financing, there are very solid solutions, taxation, and things that are very feasible. What's interesting to see in a counter-cyclical way is that when there's a negative situation, like an economic crisis, you can, in fact, even if you're a Keynesian, you can say, well, we have to use debt, for example, to absorb the shock. One of the characteristics of public debt is to be a shock absorber. When you quickly calculate the amount of money which everyone would receive in France, well, it would, the overall amount would be the sum of all the existing benefits. So if the situation is bad and you switch on this new system, you top income up in addition to other social benefits, you should also be able to sort of unplug this solution when the economy recovers and is strong. So it's really counter-cyclical. When you have a crisis like the health crisis or a technological crisis, say 40% of jobs will be destroyed in the years to come. And will as many jobs be created? For every job destroyed, technology doesn't create a similar number of jobs, but a certain number notwithstanding. So what's important is to think that this is a passing moment, and this budgetary tool should be there to absorb the shock. Yes, I'd like to speak on this point as well. Well, the Americans were the first to try and think about the consequences of their own technological innovations. It's not by chance if Gates, Musk, and others have acted the way they have. And they have talked about an additional tax. They have talked about further tax measures in sectors where machines replace people, where people are expelled from the labor market. There are means to enable them to retrain, find new jobs, and that's a form of wealth distribution. So you can think what you like. But I think these proposals at least have been supported by people who provide for a lot of the technological innovation. Now, I'd like to answer the question put by the representative of Force Ouvrière. That's a French trade union. What about the conditions at work? In a large number of sectors, whatever the action of trade unions may be, we cannot seem to significantly improve conditions at work. What we note today is that there's a lot of suffering. Well, what would the universal income change? Well, it empowers the individual. I believe that by empowering individuals, this will give more power to the group. What does a universal income change? Say in old people's homes, for people who work there. People who work in old people's homes have found their work, the conditions of their work have deteriorated. There is still the same number of workers, but the number of old people has increased, and therefore working conditions have gotten worse. If men and women working in old people's homes had a universal income, they could say to the employer, if the working conditions don't improve, then I'm going to quit my job. And it's an area which needs labor, which needs people. So this would change the terms of negotiation with employers. I believe, therefore, that a universal income is one of the tools which will make it possible to improve conditions at work. And perhaps trade unions should look now at the efficacy of their own action in this respect. Thank you very much, Benoit Hamon. We don't have much time left. I do apologize to Alfonso Pratgay. We don't have time to give you the floor again, but thank you very much for being with us. Thank you to all our panel members. Thank you for being present here today.